Now if you take this up, then you get D30, usually in this range. In Holland we have a D60, which we hardly ever use in this country. But we have a D100 in Holland, which never been used here, and 200. And that's basically the D scale. Hahnemann only used up to 30 often in his beginning of his life. And a lot of people still use this D1, D2, D3. In Holland it's very often low potency, so it's a lot of organicity, so a lot of the substance is still present. They don't often go beyond the higher ones, and they work very well. The Kentian scale, the C scale, really introduced more like by Kent, and usually we have a 6. If there's not a number attached to it, we automatically assume it's the C scale. So you don't have to write C6. If you say Cantor 6, it means C6. 6, 12, 30 usually. There's no reason why 18 shouldn't work, but basically people have just standardized. Otherwise pharmacists have to carry 200 or 10,000 different units, and they have no shelf space for this. So hence the practice. Now this is where the confusion comes in. 100 to the minus 6, 100 to the 12, 30 times, C200, then a 1M, M being 1,000, that's 1,000, C1000, and then a 10M, C10,000. And that's where we often think is our border. That's the ceiling. We think, well, if a remedy, we build up, we go to a 10M, and then if the case doesn't respond, we need another remedy. Big mistake often, because it doesn't mean that that's your ceiling. The fact that pharmacists don't have readily available something else doesn't mean you can't get it, because there are 50 M's, and there are 100 M's, and there are 1,000 M's. They are available, although these two probably not very common, because it takes a long time to make them. You can imagine how many stages you've got to go through. I won't go through the preparation process, because you need there's different ways of preparing these things, and I won't elaborate on that. But know that this is where the confusion can come in when we talk about M's. Now there's a new scale, the LMs. And this is where the confusion comes, because people think LM means 50M, because 50 is L in Roman and M, and it's not the case. LMs is, and I'll put them in the middle here, I should actually just put them here. LMs basically means 50,000, that's correct, but it's 1 part in 50,000 rather than 1 part in 99.
Not 1 in 49, no.
Fair enough, okay. If you want to... That's true. That could be the case. All right. Just to know that this scale exists. They denoted by LM, whatever number it is, or in the old days, Hahnemann, I think, has called them, what they called again? Yes, but it had another connotation as well.
Q for quintessimo.
Oh yes, Hahnemann wrote them as O1, just to confuse things, O2, O3. Nevertheless, Q potencies. But LMs, and usually LMs go from LM1 up to LM30. However, you can get an LM60 as well, but usually you never need that high potencies. So, where you have 1, 2, 3, 4, the most common used, this is LM1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 until 30. It doesn't jump 6, 12, 30, 200. It goes, so there's 30 in a range usually of LM50, 1,000. Now, and I'll try and explain to you how they made, and just take it for face value. It's in your handout. Go and study it in your own time. But basically how they prepared is quite tricky, so try and follow me, because it's not that easy to grasp. You start off...
Do the pharmacists stop?
The pharmacists stock them, yes, and Helios makes them. They sometimes have 1, 6, whatever around, and if you want a 2, they'll make one from the 1, because it's easy for them to make that.
Does Ainsworth as well?
Yeah. So you can get all 30 of them, no problem. How are they made, though? I mean, this is quite simple how they're made, but an LM starts off by taking a C3. It's got to start somewhere. So that any substance can be made into an LM, but you've got to start with a C3. So that we know that if it's liquid, it's soluble in a liquid medium, like a tincture or an extract from a plant. That's usually not the problem, but a mineral is not soluble. So you need to make it soluble by triturating it in sugar and lactose 3 times. Once you get to 3rd stage, 100 to the -3, the 4th stage will become soluble. Hence the starting line of C3. So that's basically your start. So you take any substance you want to make an LM, take a 3rd centesimal of it, and you take 1 part of that into 500 drops of alcohol water mixture. And I won't go into the exact details, you can read that up. It's just to get an idea that 1 part of it into 500 drops of this will give you basically the calculations you can work out, but that will give you the mother tincture of LM. You know this mother tincture. So a C3, 1 part into 500 drops, hence the 500 component, becomes mother tincture. All right? From that mother tincture, you with me still so far? Okay. So from that mother tincture, you would take 1 drop of the mother tincture, and you dissolve it into 100 drops of alcohol, and you gave that 100 succussions. That liquid that you have, because it is liquid at that stage, is an LM1. This gets succussed 10 times. The C scale, each stage gets succussed 10 times, but the LM range gets succussed 100 times per stage. So what in essence you have is very highly diluted and highly succussed, but only a few stages. So once you've done the 1 part into 50 drops, which begins the tincture, and 1 part of that in 100 drops will give you LM1 in liquid, but that's not necessarily how it's stored. You then take a drop from that. Say you want to make an LM2. What they do is, to get the 50 component each time, is they moisten 500 globules with 1 drop from the LM1. Drop it on 500 globules, and that gets stored as LM1 as globules. Once they put on blotting paper, and because it's a high alcohol content, it evaporates and they don't cluster together, and then you have it in globules. If you now want to make an LM2,
who counts out these 500 globules?
Sure, they have weights, and now I've weighed it, and that's a standard measure, and standard vials containing so many things, so there's ways around that.
What globules are they?
Tiny pinpoint globules. They are microglobules, not really like a pinhead.
Made of what?
Sugar lactose. Now what you do is you take a single globule representing a 500th of the LM1 into 100, because 100 here drops, that becomes LM2. And subsequently you will then moisten globules, put it in a vial, and then a single globule of that into 100, LM3. Succussed 100 times each time. That's LM range. So you would think, wow, if this was little, this is nothing. It is stunning, and they are extremely effective. Hahnemann was coming to a stage in his life and he's saying, it doesn't matter how much you dilute it, even the tiniest amount is enough to have an effect. Now, why did Hahnemann do this, and how did this come about? I'll give you some background about it.
You take the 500 globules and you take one globule out of it.
One globule only.
And then add 500 globules.
No, no, one globule into 100 ml of liquid,
100 mils of it.
which is the alcohol-water mixture.
Right. Yeah.
And that gets dissolved. That you take to moisten 500 new globules and store it as an LM2 in vials and globules, which then you take one globule to make the next one.
Right.
Each stage succussed 100 times.
Is it 100 drops or 100 mils?
It's drops. They call it as drops, yes.
You just said mils.
Sorry, drops. Drops. How did Hahnemann do this? Hahnemann worked for a long time in practice and gained a lot of experience, and he stated that if you have a sensitive organism with the right remedy, so the remedy falls on fertile soil, the chances are that you're going to potentially aggravate them. And he felt that the C potencies throughout this range were too powerful. So what did he do? He decided that he came to the conclusion that something needs to change because they were too powerful, and he felt that another reasoning behind it is that he says there's a dynamic change in the patient. So if you stimulate here, the patient has improved and move on. If this is a gauge of energy, why do you stimulate with the same energy, 30, 30, 30, 30, or 6, 6, 6, 6? If there's a dynamic change in the organism, you have to follow the dynamic change with a dynamic change in your remedy. So he said, I'm abandoning giving dry globules or tablets on the tongue because that's always the same stimulus. I'm going now to go for liquid, and I can change the liquid by each administration. I succuss the liquid. So I plus it, changing the dynamics, the energy somewhat to be at a higher energy frequency, plussing it each administration. So this is where the term plussing came in. Yet, despite the fact that he did that, he felt that the C potencies were too powerful and still aggravated, and he decided that I'm going to go and make a new scale, 1 in 50,000, even dilute it higher, and still continue with the plussing. This is what his reasonings were, and they were very sound, and in the handout there are references to the paragraphs, you can read up on it. Now, Hahnemann went, and everybody worked a lot with the fifth organon, fifth edition of the organon, but these ideas came about basically in the sixth. And that was only shortly before he died, and the sixth was actually completed in 1841. And he died in 1843, and his wife Melanie at the time said, I want the sixth organon and I'll keep it.
That is wrong.
It is?
Yes, Melanie is always blamed for not releasing it. Hahnemann asked her not to release it until she found a good publisher and until the homeopathic world was ready, because he'd antagonized.
Wow, amazing.
Yeah. You can read that up in the American Homeopath, Melanie Cornfield Grimes, a lot of research on Melanie Hahnemann, and had researched Caspian. It's in Hale's autobiography of Hahnemann, where Melanie is seen as the black sheep and the one holding on to Hahnemann. But Melanie Cornfield Grimes actually dug up correspondences with Benninghausen and other people. She always tried to publish it with a decent publisher, and then she actually did hold it back because she was impoverished, losing everything in the Franco-Prussian War, and said if she would get money so she wouldn't have to practice, she would make and ensure that the copies and corrections were made according to Hahnemann's wishes. And she was never supported in the homeopathic community to do that, and died before she could fulfill this task. But it was Hahnemann's strict instructions on his deathbed for her not to just release it to any publisher. and to make sure it was handed over properly at a time when the homeopathic community was mature.
That's good to know.
Yeah.
It's, there was another homeopath, Pradès, in Belgium, who also married a younger lady. And there was the same scenario was played, that she also kept all his material and didn't release it for a long time. In fact, there's still a lot of things that's not released from Pradès, and he was very bright. But that's interesting to know that, because it's almost as if he sensed that this is very special. And the consequence of this is that Kent, who died in 1916, as far as I can tell, unless I speak on a correction, never knew about the LM potencies. So Kent only worked with the C potency scale, and he never actually had the chance to experiment. Hence we know all about the Kentian scales and stuff like that, which was really an American, because the Europeans work with the X scale or the D scale. And until eventually the material was released, and was released by Burico, who then in 1921 brought out a publication on it. But it didn't really take effect until maybe Pierre Schmidt brought it out in, I think, in '54 again. And yet, despite that, that's how recent it came about. And homeopaths wasn't really on the grabs for this. There's still a lot of homeopaths who don't work with LM potencies. And a lot of people give it a crack and then they abandon it, and I'm not sure what the reason for it is, but I can tell you it is wonderful to work with it, and I'll explain why LMs are actually a tremendous relief when we scare of aggravations. So basically that's the historical component of it. And what are the indications for LMs? Why would we choose to use an LM? Now, there's a graph in your handout comparing the centesimal with the 50 LMs. And Hahnemann stated that the period of cure with an LM is much quicker than with the centesimal. It takes too long. He says that the aggravations with the C potencies are also often too powerful. With the LMs you can avoid them. He says you may need to antidote a serious aggravation with the C scale, which in the LM scale he feels is not necessary, because they don't aggravate that long. He says it's very difficult, and this is what we found today in practice, to know where to start to treat. I mean, we've had this, do we start with a 6, do we start with a 30, do we start with a 200, and if so, how often do we give it? And there's a lot of uncertainty about potency scales and where to start. Whereas with the LMs, there's not actually a tricky decision, because you start basically with LM1 and work your way up. So you don't have to worry about, is this organic, is this functional, is this mental or emotional, therefore low potencies, high potencies, none of that. You know, we have this assumption that low potencies in the C scale works on the physical body, high potencies work on the emotional body, but LMs don't have that distinction. It works throughout the range, and you don't have to confuse yourself as to where do you start. Also, he feels that you are able to dosage more quickly with LMs, whereas in the C scale people may not be able to receive frequent dosages. That is in debate in my practice. I feel that people can also be very sensitive, and you can't always dose too frequently in LMs either. He says it's more difficult in the C scale to observe the progression of the case, whereas in LMs you can see it more quickly. And you don't have to have huge gaps. Say, well, this is a 30, now where do I go? The only option is if I need to go up, I go to a 200. Huge gap. Whereas in LMs there isn't. You go from a 1 to a 2, to a 3, to a 4. And that confusion is over. And you don't have to choose potencies anymore. Selection is so easy. So those are the advantages, and your indications for them would be, if you have a sensitive patient and you do not want to risk any form of aggravation, you consider an LM to start with. If people are frail and low in vitality, the same story. Say, well, I'll just go for an LM here. Severe pathology and you cannot risk an aggravation, really with physical changes, start with an LM. And that's basically what you do. Now there's a huge component of directions of use as to, and all references to the paragraphs which you can read up on, and I would advise you to maybe actually look at the original material. And in practice what happens? So there's one sheet, and in practice you usually would take one globule, that's advised, into maybe 150 milliliters of stock bottle. We call it a stock bottle. So one globule in 150 milliliters of a dropper bottle with alcohol and water mixture. And in practice what I would do is I would ask the patient to give a couple of succussions. Now this may sound daft, but a lot of practitioners have found that if you succuss, say, 12 times, it becomes too dynamic, it becomes too powerful. And even more obscure, somebody has said, well, where do I keep the remedy? Some people say, well, just keep it in the fridge door. But the fridge door swings open and closed every day. So you succuss that bottle about 10 times, 20 times, and they take it and they aggravate. And some practitioners have found it's best not to give that advice because you can't tolerate that amount of succussion. Sounds bizarre, but it's practical. So 2 times, 2 drops in a little bit of water. So I actually just explain, I actually do a very quick diagram because patients like to see things visually. So you take a glass that you use for this purpose, that is not contaminated with stuff. People say, well, boiled water or bottled water. I usually try and just use bottled water. I don't think in practice it makes a huge difference. 2 drops. From that, you stir it, 2 teaspoons as a dose, 2 times per week. So it's easy to remember for patients. 2 drops, no, 2 bangs. So 2 bangs, 2 drops. Stir, 2 teaspoons, twice a week. This is what I do. It's simple to start with, just basic. And then people have, I say, you spread it out Monday, Thursday. Don't take it Monday and Tuesday. Because you have 3 days to evaluate your response. And I make it very clear to the patient that if you aggravate, and you don't want aggravation with asthma, you don't want aggravation with eczema. So these guidelines are quite, most of the time people take that no problem. But sometimes you have a very sensitive individual and you would say, okay, if this upsets you, and people will know, I become wheezy or I have a headache, and it's very much associated with taking a dose, but it settles in X hours. Then I say you're sensitive, 1 drop, 1 teaspoon. See how that goes. If they are even sensitive to that, which can happen, I say take a second glass, 1 teaspoon into a second glass from that, and 1 teaspoon as a dose. Even dilute it further, and that actually works. And then just take it once a week. And that's basically the idea. Now, if people start to respond, Hahnemann has devised this 150 odd mils because he says if you treat people daily, then you would find that that amount will be sufficient for about 30 days, after which, if you need to continue to treat, you go on to an LM2 and you do the same thing. So basically for a month. But in practice, that I find is not necessary. If people respond well on an LM1, you can keep them on an LM1 until nothing happens anymore, and then you move on to an LM2. You don't have to go to an LM3 or LM2 after a month. Also, what some people give LM and they have the globules and say, well, take 1 globule. But it defeats the purpose of the succussion and the plussing and the liquid dosages. So I think in practice to give globules, although it may work, I don't know, I don't think that's the idea of Hahnemann. It really needs to be succussed and plussed. Also what people do is once they've run out and they've had a month or a time zone on LM1, they say, well, I'll just give you an LM1 again. But what's the purpose? Because you have already changed with an LM1 over this, and the dynamics has changed because you've potentized the succuster so many times. What's the point of going, if the patient is here now, going back with an LM1 and start at 0? So you need to start with an LM2 because you're then on that higher energy level, and you build it up again with plussing over time. And that basically I feel is enough in practice. And you'll find that people, when they aggravate on an LM, you can then quickly interfere. And once you stop dosing, people will come out of the aggravation pretty quickly. But if you have a 200 in the system, You can't just take that out. And people are very vulnerable and sensitive, can actually aggravate and go down pretty sharp after the 200, which in an LM, you must be very sensitive for that to happen. But be aware of your instructions, because patients think, I need to get worse before I get better. So they keep on taking the LMs, and they keep on getting worse. Because they think that's how it's supposed to go. But if there's a response, and people cope with it and they continue to improve, you can continue to dose, and in time you would phase the dosages and split the gaps between them. Hahnemann says, well, if there's a definite improvement, then you can wean it down and then stop it. But in practice you'll find that people will only need occasional doses, and sometimes the gaps between the doses are very long. It could be 2 weeks, it could be 6 months. And this really, it's a matter of, what I like about this is you give back the control to the patient. Here you've entered into some sort of a therapeutic alliance, say, well, look, we're both responsible for this therapeutic process. You are in charge. You suss out how much you can tolerate. And people will learn very fast how much they can handle. And it's really worthwhile to experiment with them.
I don't quite see why you couldn't use that all the time and not all the thing.
Well, exactly. A lot of people do. This practitioner who only works with LMs.
Yes, but the other potencies are there because there's a need for them. I mean, they wouldn't be there if there wasn't a need. And you adapt it to a person's dynamics and how stuck they are. And some people can deal with a very high potency and utilize that, and other people are better off having a gentle stimulus start again. So I think it's always important to see where the person's at and start with that. And I don't always start with an LM1. I sometimes start with an LM3 or an LM6, depending on, again, where that person's general health and vitality is. So,
sure. And people have tried all kinds of things, going up,
see what the person
down.
is. I think that's the most important thing in matching that as accurately as you can. And the safest thing is always to stay a potency below the one if you're unsure, because then you have the least chance of argumenting. Tobias has a question.
Can the LMs be dispensed in powder form or in the liquid form?
You can get it into a powder form, you can get it into granules, but it defeats the purpose of what they're designed to do.
Oh, because I've sometimes prescribed LMs in ascending powder form alternating with sac lac. Would that be appropriate or not? I would think it would be.
Well, not if you want to understand why Hahnemann made them in the first place, because the idea is to plus them each time.
Yes,
and you would have powders which would be the same energy impulse over time.
But increasing slowly.
Okay, so LM1, then a gap, LM2, LM3,
yeah.
in globules. I don't know, I've never worked like that, so in theory it
The
could...
difference is you're not plussing in between. You don't have them liquid, you're not shifting
Oh,
the
yes,
potency
yes.
in between.
But the absence of plussing in between, is that effective at all?
Well, I think plussing is quite useful. I mean, I think the idea makes sense. It may not be essential. You don't know what people do in practice, whether they always plus it, and how much they do. But people who've worked with it intensely found that it makes a big difference whether you plus 1 or twice or 20 times, because that energy increases substantially, you know, each time. Because remember, each stage has been succussed 100 times. If you then, between administration, add another 20 shakes to it, and you've done it 5 times, you've actually plussed it 100 times, another 100 on top of that. It becomes very energetic.
David?
Can you just explain what you mean by getting the patient to understand how much they can take?
Yes, I try to explain after, because it depends on what rapport you have and how much people grasp what it's about. But I feel that people will become tuned to how a remedy affects them. And they will tell you very clearly what they experience after taking a dose. Now you may say that's placebo, but they do. And sooner or later, I feel that it's nice to have almost an intuitive component to it. And say, well, look, you will know when you need another dose. And people will feel that, wow, I'm going down again. Some recurrence of symptoms, I don't feel too well, take another dose, and it improves them again. So instead of having a rigidity there, and saying, you take this every day or every second day or whatever. You actually give the control back to the patient so that they take charge of when they take it, and it works usually well.
Marcia?
Some homeopaths I've heard say that when you get halfway through the bottle of LM1, you dilute it again and bring it up to the full volume and then start. Do you use that at all? Do you think there's any purpose in it, or would you just go to LM2?
I've never done it that way. I think in theory you can top it up, and I see no reason why, if your stock run out and you haven't got an appointment, why you can't do that, and it will still be effective. But I haven't done that practice, so I've no experience as to how that will work. I can only think how it could work in theory, but sure, because ultimately you can dilute things as much as you like and it'll still be effective. A lot of people, homeopaths, have worked with a vial for life, and once they run out of their globules, they put new globules in and add a couple of drops of alcohol, pure alcohol, shake it about, and that's their new stock. And they say, well, you know, the essence of what was on the walls is again in my globules, and they never buy remedies. They go with that stock until they finish, and it's...
I have a question here.
I don't really understand why you only plus LM potencies. Could you not get the 10C and plus that?
Sure, Hahnemann has done that, and that's how he started. He actually started to plus the C potencies, and he felt that even that was too strong, and hence he had to dilute it even further, and therefore the 1 in 50,000 scale. But he did start off with plussing the C potencies, yes.
I do a lot of 12Cs. Yeah.
What do you do with it?
I plus them. Sometimes I start off just giving it, I give most of my 12Cs in liquid, and then if a person plateaus, I ask them to plus it and treat it like an LM. And then often starts the process going again. Yeah, they always get the 12s in water anyway. I always dispense 12s in water.
So they can do that.
No, not just because I do that. I found it a nice way of giving the remedy and quite a gentle way of giving the remedy. And if they plateau, I then treat a 12C like an LM. So you can do it with the C as well. Yeah.
It's, in Holland, the practitioners often use only liquid potencies. If you buy things off the shelves, you can get them. You have to sometimes request, because the major stocks are all in liquid. All right, so if we but read on it and just ponder on it, and it is very useful to use in situations where you don't want an aggravation. It's great stuff. And despite the high dilutions, it's mind-boggling, but it works very well.